He's worth nothing, Your Honor, just a man who got lucky and rode my success. My wife's voice cut clean through the courtroom, sharp enough to turn heads, and for a second, I just sat there, hands folded, breathing slow, letting the words settle like dust in sunlight, because moments like this don't explode, they tighten, they coil, they wait, and I could feel every eye in that room shifting toward me, measuring, judging, deciding who I was based on the story she was telling, and she told it. Well, confident, polished, practiced, like she'd rehearsed every line in front of a mirror, like she believed it, or worse, like she needed everyone else to believe it, and maybe that was the part that stung the most, not the words themselves, but the way she said them, like I had already been erased, like everything I built had somehow become hers to narrate, and I didn't interrupt, didn't object, didn't even look at my attorney. I just watched her, the woman I once trusted more than anyone, stand there and reduce years of quiet work into a punchline, and somewhere behind the calm, behind the stillness I kept locked in my chest, something colder settled in, something steady, because I had seen this version of her before, not in a courtroom, not under oath, but in the small moments, the dismissive looks, the subtle corrections, the way she started rewriting history long before today, and I realized this wasn't new. This was just louder, just public, just final. And the judge leaned forward slightly, listening, her pen moving across the page as Amanda continued, outlining how she built everything, how she carried the weight, how I contributed nothing, each sentence landing with just enough conviction to sound true if you didn't know better, and the room believed her. I could feel it, the quiet shift of opinion, the subtle nods, the kind of silent agreement that forms when a story fits too neatly, and I let it happen. I let her talk, because stopping her would have been a mistake, cutting her off would have saved her, and she didn't deserve saving, not from this, not from the truth she was about to walk straight into, and when my attorney leaned closer and whispered, "We should respond," I shook my head once, slow, deliberate, not yet, because timing matters more than volume, and truth, real truth, doesn't need to shout, it just needs the right moment, and this wasn't it. Not while she was still talking, still building her version of reality brick by brick, unaware that every word was locking something into place, something she wouldn't be able to undo, and I could almost see it. The invisible line she was crossing with every sentence, the point where confidence turns into overreach, where performance turns into evidence, and that's when I finally leaned forward, just slightly, enough for my voice to carry but not enough to break the calm, and I said, "Your Honor, I'd like to request 60 seconds after she's finished." And the judge glanced at me, curious now, maybe a little surprised by the tone, by the lack of urgency, by the fact that I wasn't fighting, just waiting, and she gave a small nod. "You'll have your time, Mr. Carter." And I leaned back again, hands returning to the same quiet position, eyes on Amanda as she continued, unaware, completely unaware, that I wasn't losing anything in that moment. I was letting her give me exactly what I needed. She kept talking, steady and composed, laying out numbers, dates, contributions, painting a version of our life where I was nothing more than a shadow attached to her success. And the strange thing was how familiar it sounded, not because it was true, but because she had been rehearsing this narrative for months, maybe longer, shaping it in conversations I was not meant to hear, refining it in meetings I was never invited to, until it sounded clean enough to pass as fact, and I realized sitting there that this was never just a divorce, it was a strategy, a slow, calculated rewrite of reality designed to leave me with nothing, and I had seen the early signs, the late-night phone calls she dismissed as work, the sudden interest in financial structures she used to ignore, the way she started asking questions that did not sound like curiosity but like inventory. How much was tied to the company? What was liquid? What was protected? And back then I told myself it was normal, that marriage meant transparency, that trust meant answering without hesitation, but trust without awareness is just an open door, and she had walked right through it, and I let her, because the moment I realized what she was really doing, I also realized something else. Stopping her would only delay it, but letting her continue would reveal everything, so I stayed quiet, I watched, I listened, and I prepared, piece by piece. Moving things where they needed to be, building structures she did not Understand, placing safeguards where she never thought to look, not out of revenge, not at first, but out of necessity. Because when someone you once trusted starts turning your life into a transaction, you either become the asset they strip or the one who controls the ledger. And I chose the latter. And now, as she stood there finishing her statement with that same calm certainty, I could see it in her eyes. She believed this was already decided, she believed I was already erased, and that belief was the only advantage I needed. She ended with a soft exhale, like she had just finished something inevitable, and for a moment the room stayed quiet, not out of respect, but because there was nothing left to add to a story that sounded so complete. And the judge looked down at her notes, then back up, her expression measured, neutral, the kind that leans toward whoever sounds more prepared, and Amanda sat down beside her attorney with that same composed confidence, smoothing the edge of her sleeve, not looking at me, not needing to, because in her mind there was nothing left to see, and that was the part that almost impressed me, how completely she believed in the version of events she had built. How thoroughly she had convinced herself that I was no longer part of the equation, and I stayed still for one more second, letting that silence stretch just enough to settle over the room, because silence, when used right, becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls attention without asking for it, and then I stood, slow and deliberate, not rushed, not defensive, just present, and I could feel the shift again, subtle but real, as eyes turned back toward me, expecting something emotional. Something reactive, maybe even desperate, because that is what people expect when you have just been reduced to nothing in public. But I had already lived through the real moment weeks ago, the night everything stopped making sense and started becoming clear, the night I opened a document I was never meant to see, a message chain that was not meant for me, careful words exchanged between Amanda and someone she introduced as a consultant, discussing timing, positioning, how to present the narrative so it would hold up under scrutiny, how to make sure I looked passive, uninvolved, replaceable, and I remember sitting there, not angry, not even surprised, just still, because once you see the pattern, once the pieces connect, emotion becomes less useful than clarity, and that was the moment I stopped reacting and started preparing, not for a fight, but for an outcome, and now, standing in that courtroom, I reached down to the table and picked up the folder I had brought with me. Simple, unmarked, nothing dramatic about it, which made it easy to underestimate, and I placed it gently in front of me, fingers resting on the edge for just a second before I looked up at the judge, meeting her eyes directly, steady, controlled, and I said, "Your Honor, with your permission." And she gave a small nod, curious now in a different way, and I opened the file, not all the way, just enough to see the first page, the one that mattered most, the one that changed the foundation of everything that had just been said, and for the first time since this hearing began, I saw Amanda shift slightly in her seat, not fear, not yet, but something close to uncertainty, like a hairline crack forming in something she thought was solid, and I knew then that the moment had arrived, not loud, not explosive, but precise, the kind that does not need volume because it carries weight on its own, and I lifted the first document, holding it just enough for the court to see, and said calm as ever, "I believe the court has been presented with an incomplete version of the truth." The page did not look impressive at first glance, just legal text, structured, clean, almost boring, the kind of document most people would skim and ignore, and that was exactly why it worked, because the truth does not always arrive loud, sometimes it arrives organized, precise, undeniable, and I placed it down where the judge could see it clearly, sliding it forward with a steady hand. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just certain, and as her eyes moved across the first lines, I watched the shift happen, subtle but immediate. The kind of change you only notice if you are paying attention, and I had learned to pay attention, because buried in that document was the structure Amanda never understood, the ownership she assumed but never verified, the foundation she built her entire argument on without realizing it had already been moved, legally, completely, permanently. And I spoke again, calm, even, the same tone I had kept from the beginning. "The assets in question are not held personally," I said, letting the words land one by one. "They are held in a private trust established years before this filing." And there it was, the first fracture, not loud, not dramatic, but real, because everything she had just claimed depended on something she did not actually own, and I could feel the room recalibrating, the quiet confidence shifting away from her side of the table, inch by inch, as the reality began to replace the narrative. And when I finally allowed myself to glance at her, just briefly, I saw it. That small pause in her expression, the moment where certainty hesitates, where belief meets resistance, and I knew this was only the beginning, because the document in front of the judge was not the surprise, it was the door, and it had just been opened. Her attorney leaned forward immediately, flipping through the copy with a speed that betrayed more tension than confidence, whispering something sharp under his breath as his finger traced a section he had clearly not expected to see, and that was the moment the air in the room changed, not dramatically, but enough for people to sit a little straighter, enough for the quiet assumptions to start unraveling, and Amanda noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture stiffened, the way her eyes moved from the judge to the document and back again, searching for control that was no longer fully hers, and I did not rush. I let that moment breathe, because pressure does its best work in silence, and then I continued, steady as before. The trust is irrevocable, I said, each word placed carefully, and I am not the owner of those assets in the way that has been presented here. And that was the second shift, because ownership is not about perception, it is about structure, and structure does not bend to opinion. And the judge's expression sharpened slightly, her attention no longer divided, fully anchored now on the pages in front of her, and I could feel the narrative collapsing, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way something built on assumption always does when it meets something built on fact, and for the first time since she had started speaking, Amanda looked directly at me, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with a question she could not ask out loud, how? And I held her gaze for just a second, not long enough to challenge, just long enough to confirm what she was beginning to understand, that this was never going to end the way she planned, and then I turned back to the judge, my voice unchanged, calm, controlled, the same tone that had carried me through every step of this, and I said, "And there is one more detail the court should be aware of." Knowing that what came next was not just clarification, it was the point where everything she had built would finally come undone. The room held its breath without knowing it, that quiet, invisible pause where something is about to tip, and I let it linger just long enough before I reached back into the folder and lifted the next document, thinner, simpler, but far more dangerous in what it implied, and I placed it beside the first, aligning the edges with care, because presentation matters when truth is being introduced, and I said, calm as ever, "This trust does not operate in isolation," letting the words settle before continuing. "It is governed by conditions tied to conduct, disclosure, and fiduciary integrity." And I did not raise my voice, did not look at Amanda, but I could feel her attention lock onto every syllable. Now, no longer confident, no longer detached, because something in the tone had changed, not louder, but sharper, more precise, and the judge leaned forward slightly, reading faster now, connecting what was written to what had already been said, and I continued, steady, controlled. "Any attempt to misrepresent ownership or manipulate asset claims within legal proceedings triggers a review clause." And there it was, the line that mattered, the one that turned a simple defense into something else entirely, something active, something with consequences, and I paused, just briefly, allowing the weight of that sentence to exist in the room before adding, "That review has already been initiated." And this time I did look at Amanda, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to acknowledge, because this was the moment she crossed from uncertainty into realization, the moment where the structure she relied on stopped supporting her and started working against her, and I could see it clearly now. The way her composure thinned, the way her certainty no longer held, and still, I did not rush, because this was never about speed, it was about precision, about letting each piece land exactly where it needed to, and I turned back to the judge, voice unchanged. "The findings are included in the following section." Knowing that what came next would not just question her narrative, it would redefine it entirely. The next page turned slower than the others, not because of hesitation, but because this was where the abstraction ended and the details began, and details are what change outcomes, and I watched as the judge's eyes moved across the lines, her focus tightening, no longer scanning, now analyzing, and I spoke again, calm, measured. The review identified a series of undisclosed communications and coordinated actions. Choosing each word with care, not to accuse, but to state, because facts do not need tone, they just need clarity. And I could feel the shift ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, as the narrative that once sounded complete began to fracture under the weight of specifics, and Amanda's attorney stopped whispering, stopped flipping pages, his attention fixed. Now calculating, recalibrating, because this was no longer a simple asset dispute, this was something else, something layered, and I continued. These actions were directly tied to attempts to influence asset positioning and representation prior to this proceeding. Letting the sentence land before adding, without disclosure to all parties involved. And that was the line that mattered, the one that changed perception into implication, and for the first time, Amanda did not look at the judge. She looked down, not fully, just enough to break the line of confidence she had held since the beginning, and it was a small movement, but in a room like that, small movements carry weight, and I did not press, did not escalate, because this was not about confrontation, it was about exposure. About allowing the truth to exist in its own space, and I stepped back half a pace, giving the court room to absorb what had just been introduced. Because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer passive, no longer comfortable, it was active, searching, recalculating, and I knew then that the balance had shifted completely, not in my favor, but toward the truth, and that was all it ever needed to do. The final section did not look different at first, just another page, another set of lines, but this was where everything converged, where intention became visible, and I let the silence hold for a second longer before speaking again. The review also identified the external party involved in these communications. And I did not rush the name, did not emphasize it, I simply let it exist as the judge's eyes moved across the page and paused, just slightly, and that pause told me everything. Because recognition does not need to be announced, it shows itself in stillness, and I continued, steady, controlled. This individual maintained ongoing contact during the period in which asset claims and legal positioning were being prepared. And the room felt tighter now, not louder, just more focused, as if every word carried more weight than the last, and I could see Amanda's attorney shift again, his posture no longer relaxed. His attention fixed on the document with a different kind of urgency, and Amanda herself remained still, too still, the kind of stillness that comes when movement risks confirming what is already being understood, and I did not look at her, because this was not about confrontation, it was about completion, about allowing the final piece to settle into place, and I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding the moment before finishing. The findings conclude that these coordinated actions directly conflict with the disclosure requirements tied to the trust. And that was it, not a dramatic statement, not an accusation, just a conclusion, clear and structured, and the effect was immediate, not in noise, but in absence, the absence of certainty, the absence of control, the absence of the narrative that had filled the room just minutes earlier, and I stepped back, giving space again, because once the truth is fully presented, it does not need to be defended, it simply stands, and everything around it has to adjust. The judge did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than anything said before, because it was no longer about arguments, it was about alignment, about reconciling what had been claimed with what had now been shown, and I stood there without moving, without adding anything, because there was nothing left to add, the structure had already been revealed, the details had already been placed, and truth, once complete, does not need reinforcement, it simply waits, and I could feel the shift settle fully into the room, not dramatic, not loud, but final, as if something invisible had locked into place and could not be undone, and when the judge finally looked up, her expression was no longer neutral in the same way, it was clearer, more defined, shaped by what she had just read rather than what she had been told, and Amanda sat beside her attorney, still composed on the surface. But the stillness had changed, it was no longer controlled, it was contained, the kind of stillness that holds tension instead of confidence, and I allowed myself one brief glance in her direction, not out of victory, not out of resentment, just acknowledgement, because this was never about proving her wrong, it was about allowing the truth to exist where it had been denied, and then I returned my attention to the front of the room, posture steady, voice unnecessary, because the outcome was already unfolding without me needing to guide it, and in that moment I understood something simple, something I had learned long before this room. That people can build entire realities on assumptions, on perception, on carefully told stories, but those things only hold until they meet something structured, something grounded, something real, and when they do not collapse all at once, they give way piece by piece, quietly, inevitably, until there is nothing left to stand on. And as the judge began to speak, formal, measured, outlining the next steps with a clarity that had not been there before, I felt no rush, no surge, just a steady sense of completion. Because the outcome was never in the moment she spoke, it was in the moment the truth was placed on the table, and everything after that was just a natural consequence of it, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because it has already been decided.